Thanks very much. That's great. Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Anna, for organising today's event. We're very pleased that the Academy supported this, which I think does really emphasise to us how important that this event is. I'd like to welcome everyone along too, because at the moment I think we've got about 54 people online, which is fantastic that we've got so many involved. But I must just say a few things. I won't say too much because we've got a very distinguished list of speakers, but I'd just like to say that we came to this topic through observing growing interest in loneliness over the last few years. And in fact, in the UK at the moment, they've now got a Minister for Loneliness who was appointed in 2018, which says something about the importance of this topic at a policy level. But in sociology, which is my own discipline and that of Kieran, because she's a co-convener today, and Kieran will introduce herself in a little while, there is a long interest in loneliness going back at least till the early 50s and also in the 70s. And these discussions around loneliness really reflected concerns and anxieties of that period. For example, a breakdown in civil society. However, recent interest we found has heightened, and there's been growing reference to an epidemic of loneliness, although I think most sociologists would question whether the use of the term epidemic, which invites certain responses, is the most appropriate description. But that's one that's being used, and some would say that that does represent something about the dimensions of the issue at the moment. Alongside this have been growing debates around the role of digital media in our lives, especially social media, and its role in reinforcing loneliness. For example, Sherry Turkle, that some of you may have heard about in the book Reclaiming Conversation, has suggested that digital technologies have an alienating influence and reinforce loneliness. So some interesting debates happening there around the role of digital technologies in our lives. So we thought that bringing together both this issue around loneliness or growing concerns about loneliness and digital technologies was really quite timely at the moment. And there's been quite a lot of concern amongst policymakers and service organisations to think about what might be effective strategies. And we put forward this proposal probably about mid last year to the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia with the aim of generating debate among policymakers, service providers and researchers about these issues. And they thought it was a great one to run with. And so we thought about having an event originally towards the end of this year, but because of the COVID-19 pandemic and growing reports about loneliness and some suggestion there's been increasing incidence of loneliness, people being isolated at home during the lockdown, we thought we'd bring this event forward. So we would like to generate debate, and we have given thought to the speakers because we've got some, as I said, very eminent speakers crossing different fields. They're not just from sociology, they're from psychology and social research, and we've also got someone from Relationships Australia, because a number of groups have taken interest in this event. And neighbourhood house sector, for example, a lot of local service organisations have had interest in this area. So I'd like to, at this point, introduce our keynote speaker, which is Hugh Mackay, very well-known speaker. Hugh will be known to many of you. Of course, he's a well-known broadcaster, social researcher and psychologist. He's also the best-selling author of 21 books, including What Makes Us Tick, The Good Life and Australia Reimagined. His latest non-fiction book is The Inner Self, to be published in August, concurrently with his 8th novel, The Question of Love. Hugh's got a pretty extensive CV, and he's been on lots of boards and committees over the years, including the ACT Government's Community Inclusion Board. And there's so many things here, well, I won't go on about it. I'm sure you will have read some of that in the blurb that we sent out, but I'd like to hand you over to Hugh, and thanks very much, Hugh, for agreeing to speak today. I very much look forward to it.
Thank you very much, Alan, and good afternoon, everybody. I think probably the best starting point for a discussion like this is always to remind ourselves that we humans are social beings. Like most other species on the planet, in fact, we're herd animals. We need families, groups, neighbourhoods, communities to sustain us and nurture us, to give us our sense of social identity. This concept of the sense of belonging is fundamental to our well-being. And so, like all herd animals, we suffer when we're cut off from the herd. In our criminal justice system, the worst punishment we can think of to inflict on anyone is solitary confinement. And that's because solitary confinement is the worst punishment you can inflict on a member of a social species. So the idea of social cohesion, I think, is central to this conversation we're going to have this afternoon. Social cohesion is vital for mental health. It's vital for the health of a neighbourhood, of a street, and indeed of a whole society. And yet, when you look at the sort of changes, in fact, most of the major changes that have been reshaping Australian society over the last 30 or 40 years, taken together, these changes have tended to have a fragmenting effect. It's fair to say that we are a more socially fragmented society in 2020 than we have ever been. And some of the signs of that are things like our shrinking households. More than half of all Australian households now contain just one or two people. In fact, every fourth household contains just one person, and that's the fastest growing household category in Australia, the single person household. Our relationships, including marriages, are breaking down at an unprecedented rate. Between 35 and 40% of contemporary marriages are likely to end in divorce, with all the easy to imagine consequences of that, not just for the immediate family, but for the extended family, for friendship circles, and so on. Our notorious busyness is a huge contributor to social fragmentation. In fact, I think of busyness as one of the great barriers to social cohesion, and yet we're all caught in it, aren't we? Who this afternoon is going to admit to not being busy? In fact, some people will proudly tell you they're busier in the lockdown than they were before. It's even changed the way we greet ourselves. Have you noticed that? We tend to say, how are you going? Busy? As though, come on, you know, are you busy or are you dead? You know, the switch has got to be on or off. That's a fragmenting factor. We don't have time to sit and chat. We don't have time to hang over the fence with the neighbours. Don't ask me to go to drinks, I'm too busy. Our increasing mobility, we're moving house on average once every 6 years. That obviously has a big impact on social cohesion. And then also, of course, our embrace of the information technology revolution, that great paradoxical revolution that we're all caught in the middle of, the revolution that promised to connect us like never before, and it has, but which has simultaneously made it easier than ever before for us to stay apart from each other. So when you put all those things together, it seems to me you can see the pattern of social trends over the last, well, 30 or 40 years in particular, as being rather like self-inflicted wounds on the cohesiveness of our society. These are things we've done. These trends have not been imposed on us. These trends have emerged from choices we've made about the way we'd like to live. We'd like to live in smaller households. We'd like to have fewer children. We'd like to get divorced more often. We'd like to be busy. We'd like to be devoted to our smartphones, etc. Those are all just commentaries on the way we've chosen to live. And the consequence is, without meaning to, of course, we have damaged social cohesion. Now, the result of all this, I think, is whether you want to use the word epidemic, which Alan is guarding us against, or warning us against, or just the word crisis. But one way or another, we do have a problem of loneliness on a huge scale. And the point about it, I think, is to acknowledge that it was on a huge scale before the pandemic hit. The pandemic has been like a huge social experiment, really, in how people will cope with social isolation and what its impact will be on their mental and emotional states and so on. But before any of that happened, we were a society so gripped by loneliness that a remarkable piece of research conducted jointly by Swinburne University of Technology and the Australian Psychological Society, and we're privileged to have Michelle Lim with us this afternoon. Michelle, I think, was perhaps one of the prime movers, the brain behind this project. But that survey, published in 2018, produced what I think is the single most startling statistic to come out of social research in the last 25 years. And that statistic is that 25% of Australians in that survey, this is pre-pandemic, 25% of Australians reported that they felt lonely for most of every week. An extraordinary comment on a society like ours, and confirming, Alan, I think you'll agree, that this is, if not an epidemic, then at least a major crisis. And the highest levels of loneliness tended to be among younger people, and in particular, the heaviest users of social media. So now we've got this extraordinary concept that within the social sciences, we now accept as a perfectly legitimate statement that people can be connected but lonely. So what's the problem about loneliness? We often associate it with anxiety and despair and depression, and it's appropriate to associate it with those responses. There's a huge correlation between anxiety, depression, and loneliness, but it's not only those things that we think of as mental health issues. Loneliness is also associated with increased hypertension, increased inflammation, increased sleep disturbances, cognitive decline, a greater tendency to addiction. It's no wonder that so many psychologists around the Western world, including Australia, are now saying that loneliness, social isolation, is a greater threat to public health than obesity is. That proposition, it seems to me, makes perfect sense when we understand what the health consequences of social isolation can be. Social cohesion, the sense of belonging, require face-to-face contact. Those feelings come out of our sense of being with each other. They don't just come out of an exchange of digital impulses. They don't just come out of an exchange of words. It's not just the words that enrich human communication or facilitate human communication. It's the word music as well, the tone of voice, the rate of speech, the cadences, plus the facial expressions, the postures, the gestures, the all-important eye contact, the thing neurologists talk about as retinal eye lock, and of course touch. Eye contact and touch in particular, the neurologists would say, are like superhighways to the brain. When we go online, we lose all that. And loneliness is one of the outcomes of the loss of the richness of human interaction that's only possible when we're face-to-face. It's not possible in this webinar, because although there's an illusion of face-to-faceness, actually we're not able to touch each other or make legitimate eye contact. So when we go online, we lose all of that richness. To wrap this up, I think I wouldn't be challenged if I said psychologically, Australia's greatest contemporary challenge is to maintain social cohesion so that we minimise the risk of social isolation and its consequences. And a key part, gets us to the core of this afternoon's conversation, a key part of maintaining social cohesion is, yes, to embrace information technology for its brilliant convenience and its efficiency, as evidenced in this webinar, but to keep it in its place. To remember that when we go online, we always lose something precious. And when we stay online too long, we're effectively consigning ourselves to social isolation and the attendant heightened risk of loneliness. Thank you, Alan.
Thanks. Fantastic. Very succinct statement of your position. I think we're all pretty clear as to how you think about this issue. So thanks for that. That's really good. I'd like to now introduce Vanessa Berhold, who's Professor of Gerontology in the School of Nursing, the School of Population Health, Faculty of Health and Medicine at the University of Auckland. Vanessa was previously a Director of the Centre for Innovative Ageing in the College of Human and Health Sciences, Swansea University in Wales, and Director of the Pan Wales Centre for Ageing and Dementia Research, and founder of the Institute for Creative Ageing Industries in Wales, UK. So she comes with a lot of experience, and also that cross-national experience, which is very valuable. So thanks very much for coming along, Vanessa, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Alan. I just want to start by sharing my screen. So thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar today to talk about older people's family relationships and the impact of technology-mediated communication, which I'm going to refer to as TMC, on isolation and loneliness. Today I'm going to give you a very brief overview of some analysis of some data collected in Wales, UK, from around 2,000 older people, which we used to examine whether TMC had functional or emotional equivalence to face-to-face contact in family relationships. And we did this by scrutinising the effects of phone, text and email and video calls on isolation and loneliness of older people. And I want to, first of all, define those two concepts because I am using them very differently. I'm defining social isolation as an objective assessment of meaningful social contact or small network size, and defining loneliness as that subjective negative emotional experience that's the reaction to a mismatch between the quality and quantity of relationships that are expected and those that we actually achieve. So I'm starting from the premise that family proximity is associated with loneliness and isolation for older people. So older people who live closer to their families experience lower levels of social isolation, with the converse being true. Those that live further away experience more isolation. And the same relationship is observed for loneliness. If you live closer to your family, you're more likely to experience less loneliness. But this association is explained, at least in part, by the opportunities for face-to-face contact. So if you live nearby to your family, you're more likely to have more frequent face-to-face contact and experience less social isolation, and similarly experience less loneliness. Now, we were particularly interested in that red arrow that you see on the right of the screen there, and that's the relationship between face-to-face contact and social isolation. We particularly wanted to know whether TMC diminished the influence of face-to-face contact on social isolation or loneliness, given that the proximity of an older person to their family members. So we conducted a series of analyses, which we referred to moderated mediation analysis. And starting first with social isolation, we found that phone calls did indeed diminish that influence of face-to-face contact on social isolation. So in other words, people had low levels of face-to-face contact with their families, could supplement it with phone calls and reduce their feelings of isolation. Similarly, text and emails also diminished the association between face-to-face contact and social isolation. But video calls, so our Zooms or Skypes, had no effect on social isolation. We repeated the analyses with loneliness as an outcome, and we found a different pattern of association. In this case, telephone calls had no effect on that association between face-to-face contact and loneliness, nor did text and emails, and nor did video calls. We were interested, though, whether there were any differences between age cohorts. So was there a difference between people who were less than 75 and those who were older than 75 in these patterns of association with TMC and the impact on the relationship between face-to-face contact and the outcomes. So we ran analysis for both groups, looking at group comparisons, and we observed exactly the same associations as I've just shown, with one exception. And that was for older people who were younger than 75, phone calls did diminish the influence of face-to-face contact on loneliness. So how did we interpret all of these analyses? So we could interpret it that telephone calls, text and emails are used as substitutes or to supplement in-person contact because they reduce the influence of face-to-face contact on social isolation for older people in both age cohorts. Now, video calls weren't frequently used in our sample and they didn't have an influence on social isolation. Remember, we're taking into account family proximity and face-to-face contact in these models. So it seems that the oldest technologies, telephone, text and emails, may be now part of those routine communication practices for older people, but those more recent technologies, video calls, are used less frequently. Now, none of the TMC had emotional equivalence to face-to-face contact. It didn't impact on loneliness. So we interpreted this as it doesn't match up to older people's expectations concerning what family relationships would be like in later life. And as Hugh explained, we can't touch, we can't feel perhaps the same types of things, and it certainly doesn't match up to what people may have perceived their relationships to look like in later life. However, that influence of telephone contact on loneliness in the younger cohort could suggest that there's a normative lag between the functional and emotional equivalence of communication technologies to face-to-face contact. So that is, there's a delay between widespread use of TMC in family contact and incorporating that into our expectations about family relationships. So in the future, TMC may impact on loneliness if we expect it to play a part in our relationships. And so if it catches up with the reality of the ways that we are maintaining contact within our families. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. I'm going to take over at this point. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Kieran Pinahar. I'm based at Deakin. I've recently moved there, and Alan and I have been working on this proposal and this project together with our next speaker, who is Dr. Barbara Barbosa-Neves. We're delighted to have you, Barbara. And Barbara's recently joined Monash as a senior lecturer in sociology. She's also an elected board member of the International Sociological Association, and she describes herself as a sociologist of technology, specializing in aging and social inclusion in later life. So there's some nice dovetails with Vanessa's work as well. In particular, she studies loneliness and social isolation among older people and the role of technologies, communication apps, robotics, and virtual reality in providing opportunities and challenges to tackle these phenomena. Her research has been used to improve the design of technology for older people and to inform care practices and policy in Canada, Europe, and Australia. So she brings with her a really great international perspective, and we're conscious that we do have some international participants. So it'll be great to benefit from some of those insights. So over to you, Barbara.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I will talk today about 3 lessons that I learned from my research in Canada and in Australia. And these lessons pretty much outline challenges, which is a better word for failures, but also I hope opportunities to inform this conversation today about loneliness and technology from a multidisciplinary lens. So a little bit of context. My work bridges sociology and computer science to really understand the lived experiences of loneliness among older people, age 65 and plus, living in care homes, and how and if we can respond to it using technology, not to replace, but to supplement social interaction. And I work with this group because it is a particularly vulnerable group to loneliness according to all the representative data that we have so far. My work also draws on mixed methods, so quantitative and qualitative, and participatory research. And this means that I involve older people not as subjects, but as partners to understand from their perspectives what they're going through and how together we can co-develop or co-refine technology-based initiatives. So as a sociologist, I focus on the connection between the individual and their social and technical contexts. So my lessons based on co-designing and failing and testing as well in the process technology with for older people to address loneliness are the following. First lesson, the one size fits all is very limited if we really take into account the complexity of loneliness in later life and the diversity of the older population. Older people are a very heterogeneous group, and so one app or one technology is often limited to meet their social connectedness needs. We need more research that compares different technologies and their affordances. And something that our research has been showing for a long time is that we need to focus on the type of use of technology and the context of use of the technology, and not only on frequency of use. When we design technology, we are designing social technical systems. Technology cannot be seen in isolation. Social contexts are critical and they can affect how technology is used and its impact. Second lesson, designing social technology for the individual is not enough. We need to account for their multiple social contexts. For example, just to give you an example, I co-designed an accessible communication app for frail older people living in care homes. And the aim here was to reinforce meaningful interactions, so social connectedness, with existing close relationships, families and friends. And the app allowed users to send and to receive video, text, pictures, and also audio messages. And since our participants had physical impairments and dexterity issues, for example, they had hand tremors due to Parkinson's disease, the app didn't include typing, but it included tapping or swiping. And it was also interesting because when we were co-designing the app, our participants wanted an asynchronous communication tool, so not real time, because they wanted to control when the communication was taking place and they wanted to regain a sense of agency. So we designed the app like that. We then tested the app in longitudinal studies in various care homes or different cross-cultural groups, so in the field and over time. But we could see right away those different intergenerational perspectives, practices, and expectations in terms of communication emerging. The family members wanted real-time communication, our participants didn't. Family members and friends really liked to send and receive video and video messages and images. Our participants prefer audio and text. So I have many, many examples of our contextual challenges, including with staff, care home dynamics, and other residents. And this leads me to my final lesson, which relates to stigma and old age scripts. Several participants in Canada, in Australia, asked me so many times if we could design something, a technology that makes it okay to talk about loneliness. As we know, technology on its own is limited to address the stigma of loneliness in later life. We also need to be very careful, very cautious of techno-solutionism, so thinking that technology is going to solve all our problems. And we could see in our studies how stigmatizing admitting to loneliness was for our participants when they talked to others. They were already frail, living in nursing homes, experiencing ageism, and this feeling of loneliness for them was another layer of failure. Additionally, they are constantly confronted by stereotypes about lonely older people, from the language we use to talk about loneliness as an epidemic, for example, which for them comes across as a quickly spreading virus. But also they often internalize old age scripts about little life, about technology, about frailty. So to conclude, when we study and when we talk about loneliness, we also need to destigmatize loneliness and not make it worse. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara.
Thank
You've
you.
given us lots of food for thought, and it'll segue nicely into one of the questions where we ask participants to consider some interventions that might be effective. And you've given us a sense of some of the practical challenges of designing interventions to address loneliness. I'd now like to invite our third speaker, Dr. Michelle Lim, who Hugh has already mentioned her excellent work at Swinburne, and she's a senior lecturer and clinical psychologist at the Everson Health Innovation Research Institute and Centre for Mental Health at Swinburne University of Technology. She's also the head of social research and wellbeing, the head of the social research and wellbeing laboratory, which aims to generate rigorous research on loneliness across the lifespan in order to inform evidence-based interventions that can effectively target loneliness. She's also the Chief Scientific Advisor for Ending Loneliness Together, which is a national Australian network made up of 10 universities and 20 industry partners. And I know Michelle has been having a bit of challenges with the audio and video, so we're going to just see how we go. But I'm hoping that we'll be able to hear you clearly and that you're able to hear us. So over to you, Michelle, and thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Kieran. Thank you everyone for giving your time today to listen to, I guess, this theme about loneliness, which is very important. As Hugh mentioned, in pre-COVID times in 2018, we found that 1 in 4 Australians reported what we call most kind of problematic levels of loneliness. This particular study actually tracked Australians over time, but we actually did not report that, but it's something that we're modeling at the moment. One of the things that we expect to find is very similar to some of the longitudinal studies that we did before. So I did a study in 2016 that looked at how loneliness at an earlier time predicted high levels of depression, high levels of social anxiety, and high levels of paranoia in a non-clinical population across a 6-month period. But what was really interesting was that the mental health symptom that predicted loneliness was actually social anxiety, so above and beyond even depression. So that was very interesting, and that's in the sample of 18 to 90. And we're seeing similar effects right now in the Australian population. But with the APS report, I think one of the most startling things that came out was actually the fact that Australians, in terms of what we call social isolation risk, or not loneliness, but the degree of contact they had with people, we assessed that within their friends, their family, and their neighbors. We found that Australians were really terrible actually seeking support from their neighbors, which says to me there's a gap in the way we actually connect with other people, and that really that is that one support that we really need to be better at, which is using the community and people that we live with, not just with people we know, but people we live around and with as well. The Vic Health loneliness, Young Australian Loneliness Survey in the year after also went a bit, I guess, surprising in my view, in that even though we found 1 in 4 young people aged 12 to 25 reported problematic levels of loneliness, what we didn't expect to find was actually the 18 to 25-year-olds were significantly more lonely. So this particular report is at the one time point, so we are unable to identify what the predictors of what was driving this effect. So my hypothesis would have been that younger people, or adolescents in particular, were much more vulnerable, but in fact we found the opposite. And it could be associated with things like life transitions, living arrangement, going into new training. And these social transitions are particularly stressful, similar to what we're going through right now in COVID, where we've never had a pandemic before, and we've really had these significant social disruptions to our lives, and many of us had to adhere to social distancing and if you're in Melbourne, it's probably not a good time right now, but we're going through another outbreak. And so we have to maintain these social distancing practices for the sake of public health. We have a survey going on at the moment, and we've just closed the first time point where we actually look at social media use during COVID. And a lot of the Australians that we measured was around the March, so when lockdown happened. And what we really, what I thought was quite interesting, and this is across, again, over 18s and across all the way to 89, was we found there was this U-shaped curve between the use of social media and loneliness, which is very similar to what we might call the Goldilocks hypothesis around social media use in mental health research. So not too little or not too much is better for you. So too little or too much is actually associated with high levels of loneliness. And if you kind of pin that back to the research especially in young adults, that's very much the case. So actually saying to an adolescent or young adult that they cannot use social media actually increases high levels of depression and anxiety. It almost kind of triggers an increase in this sense of being excluded from their peers, because that's what their peers are doing, being on social media. But after a certain amount is probably, again, this over-reliance on social media for all the wrong reasons, and potentially would actually be detrimental to your health. And so some research around the use of social media and loneliness really talks a little bit about, it's not so much social media per se, it's about how you use it and how you, what kind of things or how you interact on the system. I have friends who've tried very, very high level, very exciting social media tools in young people with psychosis in the US. And what they found was that those who didn't make the effort to interact with other people in the system, who were, I guess would say, lurking on social media platforms, are the ones that are most lonely. But if they did interact and they did support and they did reciprocate interactions online to a certain degree, their loneliness actually decreased. So this actually then kind of lends itself towards you know, our social behaviors and how we can actually show others that we care and we are willing to connect. And I kind of think back about some of the interventions I use, which is more skill-based, but it kind of really taps into what we call strengths-based approaches. Activities that can elicit bonding, that can actually teach us the social hygiene practices that we are meant to do, but we don't do. Things like showing kindness to your neighbors or to people you know, showing interpersonal gratitude, saying thank you to people that are in our lives that have made a difference, signaling things like positive affect so that you know that people can pick up cues that you're willing to connect. So if I go around, for example, scowling and I'm in a bad mood and I'm not looking at people, I'm less likely to make a friend, or I'm more likely to cause some sort of negative impact on the people around me. So I think it's really important that, you know, although those are skills that we should know, we don't practice them. And there's scope for us to do those things. And this is very, very much consistent with Professor Cassiopo's social cognition model, where lonely people don't show many pro-social behaviors, and in turn actually perpetuate that cycle for themselves, where they get stuck into loneliness because they are not signaling the right emotions, or they're not showing the right actions to people for them to actually make those deeper connections. So I think it really says something about as well, you know, how do we reduce loneliness, not just, I guess, within society, but what can an individual do as well. So from that perspective, it kind of puts a little bit of the ownership on the lonely person. And of course, that's not always the case, because there are people who are lonely, who are not actually themselves, you know, doing anything in particular to actually perpetuate this cycle. So when I kind of think about loneliness, I think about different ways of tackling it. So on an individual level, where the lonely person can be very mindful of themselves, of making sure that they don't signal the wrong kind of emotions to other people, and practice good social behaviors and maintain relationships, possibly as well on a relationship level where they can actually work with those skills with other people. It could even be with colleagues, or the community level. So we really need to be more kind to our neighbors, lend them a hand, and actually be more pro-social there. But also there's lots of things that we can do within the societal level. What kind of things are encouraging our young people to adapt better or make a better transition from, say, high school to further training and further education. So there's lots of things we can do. It's not just one thing. And I think we really need a coordinated and national approach to tackling loneliness.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I think you've given us a good sense of the multifaceted approach that we'll need, that extends far beyond individual interventions, but may well include them, and also a good insight into the psychological effect or perspective on the effects of social media on mental health and loneliness, and some of the strength-based approaches that we might pursue. Our final speaker is Nick Tebby from Relationships Australia, and Nick is going to give us a perspective from the community and service provision sector. And we wanted that, as Alan mentioned, we wanted to include a range of speakers from different disciplines, and also to get a sense of the challenges for service provision and in the community sector in addressing loneliness. And Nick has had over a decade of private legal practice, and he worked for a number of years in the social and community sectors, including as CEO of the Settlement Council of Australia, which is the peak body for migrant and refugee settlement services. And he's now the National Executive Officer of Relationships Australia. In this role, he's proud to be working with a dynamic team to represent the Relationships Australia Federation in policy and advocacy matters, and to help promote the rights of all people in all their diversity, to live with dignity and to enjoy healthy, respectful relationships. And today, I think he's going to speak to us a little bit about Neighbour Day, and that segues nicely from some of the things that Michelle was mentioning about the need to connect communities. So I'll hand over to you. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks very much, Kieran, and thank you very much everyone for having me join you today. It's quite a pleasure to be here amongst a lineup of very eminent researchers, and to give you a bit of a social and community-based perspective. So I will just share my screen. Hopefully this works. There we go. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Relationships Australia, as Kieran has said, is a community-based federation of not-for-profit organisations that for over 70 years have provided relationship, family and individual support services for all members of the community. And our work within communities has confirmed what we've already heard from a number of the speakers today, and that is the growing prevalence of loneliness within Australia and the negative physical and mental health impacts that this has. Recognising this and the deficit in strong neighbourhood connections that both Hugh and Michelle have talked about, Relationships Australia is very proud to be the home of the national celebration of social and neighbourhood connection, which is Neighbour Day. Neighbour Day is an early intervention strategy. It promotes community connectedness and brings people together to reduce social isolation. Its principal aim is to empower Australians to build better relationships with the people who live around us, especially the vulnerable and the elderly. So Neighbour Day was founded in Melbourne in March 2003 by Andrew Heslop, after the remains of an elderly woman were found inside her suburban home. Some of you may remember this story. Mrs. Elsie Brown was found dead after 2 years. And in that time, she'd been forgotten by her neighbours, her friends and her family. This prompted Andrew to suggest that we start a National Check on Your Neighbour Day, which he had published in a letter to the editor in The Age in 2003. And that, well, what followed from that was the launch on the 30th of March 2003 of the very first Neighbour Day. Since then, Neighbour Day has been celebrated every year on the last Sunday in March. And it's progressed from a reminder to connect with our elderly neighbours to a much bigger annual celebration of what is a strong community. Now, over the years, we've had a lot of anecdotal evidence that tells us the importance of a campaign like Neighbour Day for promoting social connection. However, in an effort to better understand the effects of Neighbour Day, we've commissioned and worked with a number of university partners on research to evaluate Neighbour Day. The first research was conducted by our friends at Swinburne University of Technology in 2018, and it told us that Neighbour Day events were diverse, and what I think is really important, they adapted to the local neighbourhood context. It also told us that some of the immediate effects of Neighbour Day were about creating new relationships, but also renewing past relationships and deepening existing relationships. Our evaluation of Neighbour Day in 2019 was a collaboration with the Australian National University and showed us that for people who participated in Neighbour Day, or importantly hosted an event, there was an increased sense of identification with their neighbourhood, an increased sense of belonging, and reduced loneliness among the respondents. Now, did this have a lasting impact? That was the next piece that we were quite interested in. So we came back 6 months later at the end of 2019 and asked the same respondents and found, and while obviously you can't read those graphs on your screen, we found that while there'd been a slight drop in both neighbourhood identification and a sense of belonging since the time immediately following Neighbour Day, the measures were still significantly higher compared to the yellow bar on your screen, which was the pre-Neighbour Day responses. So what we're seeing is that an event like Neighbour Day is having lasting effects on senses of belonging and neighbourhood identification. So that put us in a good position to launch into Neighbour Day 2020. And of course, we were very excited to promote an event that was about creating connections, and promotion for that began in October 2019, but of course was largely hijacked by COVID and everything that happened at the beginning of March, which meant that Neighbour Day was going to have to look very different this year. No longer could we promote the idea of physical contact with your neighbours, of barbecues, of street parties. These were all off the agenda, and instead we were promoting what we termed to be creative connections. Now, the importance of this, and I think we've already heard about it from some of the other speakers, but our 2020 evaluation of Neighbour Day, which is still in the analysis phase, some of the preliminary findings of that showed us that in that period from March to April 2020, experiences of loneliness increased dramatically among participants, and accordingly, reports of well-being decreased. Now, I think with everything that was going on in relation to COVID, that isn't a huge surprise, but nevertheless, it shows us the need for social connection and just how important it is as we were all forced into self-isolation, especially that we start checking on the more vulnerable members of our community. And this is where really digital technology came into its own, and we were able to harness it. I think the Australian population really has been able to harness digital technology in this time in ways that perhaps before we never really expected. Because digital technology has given us an opportunity to expand what we think of as our community, of who we think of as our neighbours, into a whole range of people from whom we can draw support, whether that be family, friends, online communities, or indeed still our physical neighbours. So attention turned to promoting, instead of physical connection, socially distant connection, and with the help of some of our well-known ambassadors and a lot of media interest, as you can imagine at the time, we were able to promote how Australians can maintain social connection despite the restrictions. And just some of the innovative ways that people did this are set out on the table here. Now, I think what's really important is that we saw this. We were inundated with stories of people who were finding creative ways to be connected and looking for ways to build their relationships and maintain some level of connection. And again, coming back to the preliminary data from the ANU evaluation, we see that people who took some form of action are reporting a higher sense of neighbourhood identification at this time, a higher sense that they have the support of their neighbours at this time, and ultimately this is leading to increased well-being and reduced loneliness among those people. So this is one example of an early intervention that we think has significant prospects. It shows the strength of community and neighbourhoods. And I think this year, in defence of digital technology, it has given us some hope that there is a role for digital technology when other options fail us, to keep people connected and to maintain those connections. So thank you, Kieran and Alan and everyone else.
Okay, well, thank you all from on behalf of the Academy of the Social Sciences for coming along today and contributing. Alan and Kieran, I'll hand over to you to wrap up.
Okay, thanks everybody. That's been fabulous. I mean, there's a lot to summarise there, and I won't attempt to do it all. But the presentations were very complimentary, and it fulfilled my expectations, far surpassed them actually. But this is really just the beginning of a broader community debate that we wanted to encourage. And I think one of the things that often happens with academics who do research is they don't engage with the groups who are the recipients of research, and they don't engage with the service organisations and government departments that have authorities in these areas. So I'd really like to thank the Academy of Social Sciences for really running with this. That's fantastic. And Chris and Anna, you've done a lot to prepare for today, and there's others as well that have supported this event. So I really appreciate that. Kieran, was there anything else that you'd like to mention before we just finally wrap up?
No, I think that about covers it, but also to thank our speakers for their time, and for everyone for engaging in the discussion yeah, so meaningfully in the breakout rooms. I don't think there's anything else. Oh, and perhaps just a plug for the podcast that Academy of Social Sciences recorded with Hugh as part of in the lead up to this event. If any of you are interested, I'm sure Anna can share the link, and it's also available on Twitter. And I think it canvasses some of the issues that we've discussed today in greater detail if you'd like to access that.
Okay, so thanks to all the speakers, and I think we're about ready to sign off at this point. So thank you very much, and look forward to catching up with some of you in due course.